Hey everybody. So I want to talk today about the third section of my historical analysis in the ontological thesis. And this is going to be modern philosophy. And I think what I want to do today is go ahead and read this first section under modern philosophy. Which there's going to be a little bit of an introduction to modern philosophy, kind of putting it in context and things like that. And then what I'm going to do is, probably read through Baruch Spinoza, because that should be the first member in our lineup. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's see what page this is on. It looks like modern philosophy is going to start on page 50. So let's see if those numbers line up with the book, the way the book has been bound, or the thesis has been bound. Okay. Yes. So it does start on page 50. So let's begin with modern philosophy. From the beginning of the 1600s on into the latter half of the 19th century, the flourishing of modernity among philosophical thinkers changed the way commonly held ideas were construed by the academic community. Skepticism, a long-held tradition among the ancient Greeks and a thorn in the side of the scholastic fathers, was stopped in its tracks with the fury of hard foundationalism. Reason and experience via sense were both put in the high places, and idols were constructed to please each figure of light. All of this talk was capped off by Kant, who was said to have found a happy medium between sense and reason, and to have reopened the door to subjectivist thought. Ultimately, however, the base of all this thought is centered around being. That is to say, it involves ontology. And where discussion of ontology is found, there is usually a critique of the ontological argument. Alas, the defenses of the ontological argument in the modern period are spat upon as weak definitional victories, while the criticisms are revered as in-depth and insightful. While criticism in the modern period opened the door for more enlightened discussion, it is also my view that those who supported this argument exposed some keen lines of conversation. Thus, by downplaying an entire half of the modern era, most scholars miss out on interesting and cutting questions. Okay, so now we're going to start Baruch Spinoza. 1632 to 1677 CE, Common Era. Perhaps the most radical metaphysician to ever appear on the philosophical stage, Baruch Spinoza was an 800-pound gorilla that had no time for the modern tradition of ontological conformity. In every aspect of his scandalous system, this barely bearded this barely bearded brute ravaged the ancient literature in search of ontological ideologies that would make David Lewis cringe. The crayon that he used to color outside the lines of rational thought was a pantheism that bled into the minds of other modern thinkers. Particularly, the entire system of Leibnizian thought was an open-mouthed response to Spinoza's ethics. Consequently, the rummage of this extremist position too often finds its way into the work of current scholarship. For example, Spinoza's necessitarianism is worshipped by the brilliant logician Timothy Williamson, and Spinoza's pantheism is lapped up by the somewhat sane mind of Robert Adams. With all of this ludicrous talk about necessity of being and ways the world might be, it is only natural to question the sanity of these scholars. This being the case, it is merely prudent to complete a mock psychological exam in order to find out exactly what is going on in the heads of these academics. And now footnote 87. I am well aware that Sigmund Freud would not appreciate conducting a psychoanalysis on dead people, but considering the circumstances, the truth is more important to ascertain than Freud's would-be objections. Now, I just want to say here that there is sort of a lightheartedness that this takes on. This isn't to confuse anybody with sincere, issues of people, being troubled. But what this is to do is to kind of critique or say, these ideas are just so out there. It's like, good night, Spinoza, what were you thinking, right? So there's some of these jabs are kind of should be seen in that light, and don't take this as a serious psychological critique. There are real diseases, problems, and things, but that's not what we're talking about here, okay? So just see it through that lens, right? First, an examination will be conducted on Spinoza's broader system of thought. It is from here that these extremist principles arose. Once Spinoza's system has been drowned in criticism, so too will his followers rest at the bottom of the sea. At this psychological exam, Spinoza and all of his adherents will be present. This is important because they need to be able to hear each other's testimonies. The examination will be administered by a highly educated therapist. Following are the germane portions of the transcript of this groundbreaking examination. Okay, so this is going to be like Bonaventure, where I go between these two different personas. Okay. Therapist. Mr. Spinoza, I see you have come to me regarding questions over your sanity and how best to treat this, quote, predicament. I think we must discuss your ideas, as they might shed light on your situation. Then we may continue with proper treatments. Is that all right? Spinoza. The only substance is God, and there are infinitely many modes of that substance, triple exclamation point. Therapist. Precisely. I see that traditionally Anselmian dialogue begins with the idea of God. However, in your system of reason, ontological arguments begin with the idea of existence. Could you explain yourself? Spinoza. In a way, my ontological arguments are reverse ontological arguments. Two principles underlie the groundwork of my system. The first inadvertently relies on Descartes' desideratum of self-existence. And then footnote 88, I say specifically this is the cogito, but in general, Spinoza hates Descartes. This connection, therefore, is more due to happenstance than any other factor. Okay, back up to Spinoza. To be clear, I hate Descartes, but I like the idea that at least one entity must exist, namely myself, because if I did not exist, there would be no doubter of objects. Next is the definition of God. Quote, by God I mean an absolutely infinite being, that is, a substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essence. And then footnote 89, Benedictus de Spinoza and G.H.R. Parkinson, Ethics, Oxford University Press, 2000. All right. From these two principles, the following argument flows forth. Quote, God or substance is the ongoing activity of self-actualization. Its causality is the infinite unfolding of its own essence, and its effects are its own infinite and finite modes that unfold from it according to the necessity of its nature. God's power is to actualize its essence according to the necessity with which it unfolds. In other words, God's power is his essence itself. This proposition nicely sums up part 1, in which we have struggled to understand how being is God and how God is active causal power. And then footnote 90, I say Spinoza, Ethics, page 45. All right. For comprehension purposes, the modern reader would be better served if this passage was reworded into the form of a syllogism. Consider the following reversal of the ontological argument, and that's Spinoza talking here, of the ontological argument. 1. God's perfection entails his infinitude. 2. If God is infinite, then he has an infinity of attributes, each consisting of infinite depth. 3. There is at least one existent. 4. Therefore, God exists. Okay, and footnote 91 says this is my own rendition, meaning this is my own rendition of Spinoza. Okay, so therapist. Okay, at first blush, the unfortunate consequence of this argument is that the universe must be infinite. If God has an infinity of attributes, each of which is infinite, and you are a pantheist, it seems that you must take space to be infinite. This is where we're starting to get into questions, parenthetically, this is where we're starting to get into questions of space and God's relationship to it. Okay. So footnote 92, a generous interpretation might turn to his original wording and try to portray the universe as an effect, in quotes, of God rather than an attribute, quote, or quote attribute. Under this light, an effect could be finite, whereas the Spinozian divine attribute must be infinite. All right? So that's footnote 92. So all right, Spinoza. In a way, yes, but there's more to it. The term pantheism needs to be properly defined, and people who read my work must be cognizant of how I use it and how philosophers throughout history have used it. Traditional pantheists like Bruno or Heraclitus would maintain that the universe is identical to God. From the presentation above, this is not my point. The idea is that the universe is an attribute of God. The only way to combine the idea that the universe is an attribute of God with the thought of my pantheism is to say something like the following, quote, if substance X has attribute A, then X equals A, okay, end quote. So, and that was just putting that in quotes, it's not an actual quote. All right, to reiterate the words of my friend across the room, Peter Van Wagen, so that he's pointing at the people who are watching the interview here, excuse me. The attempt to promote this premise, quote, is awkward for Spinoza's metaphysics, end quote. So that is awkward for Spinoza's metaphysics is what I'm quoting from Van Wagen. And this is footnote 93, so this is Jonathan Bennett and Peter Van Wagen, and also Jared Charles, The Logical Structure of Spinoza's Ethics, Synthesis, Volume 1, 1978, Journal of Symbolic Logic, 1984. So I guess I was quoting a couple different articles here. Not entirely sure why I put quotes before Jared Charles, but I think that just may have been could have been a typo. But yeah, so I guess I was citing two different articles here. Oh, no, this is, okay. I would have to look at this a bit more in detail. Yeah, Journal of Symbolic Logic, 1984, and Synthesis, 1970. Okay, this is not important. The more important thing is that this is what Van Wagen was saying. I had a footnote here. We can make a little bit more sense of that later. That is okay, though. All right, moreover, quote, from this, it follows trivially that if X has A and Y has A, then X equals Y, which means that no two substances can share an attribute, footnote 94, Ibid, probably page 997, and then here's what I say. I'm well aware that there's quite a controversy on what Spinoza thought about attributes. The reason I do not dive into these controversies here is that they're mainly a matter of translation. This is to say that taking the time to talk about objectivism, subjectivism, would distract from the focus of this paper. Additionally, I am cognizant of the fact that the way in which these attributes relate to one another is questioned as well. It seems to me that the best way to relate Spinoza's attributes consistently is to adopt some sort of modal parallelism. For further explication of which historians I favor, see the general work of Karl Jaspers and Marshall Geroult on, Gueroult on Spinozian attributes. All right, so that's footnote 94. Okay, and Spinoza's still talking here. Indeed, my system becomes less awkward when definitions are delved into even further. For example, when I discuss the universe, I'm talking about the components of thought and extension. In this light, thought and extension are attributes of God, and the only sense in which I would label them infinite is that they are indivisible. This is to say that God's attributes of space, God's attribute of space is not an aggregate of finite parts, because there is no such thing as a smallest finite division of thought or extension. With this concept nailed down, the most radical label that I can receive is that of a strong panentheist. If you want a thorough defense of this view, I suggest you read my pal, Robert Adams, in his excellent book, and then I say ... Therapist, believe me, I will get to him. Continue on with your current system. Spinoza, okay, I apologize. This is the only position that allows the universe to be, quote, in God, as an attribute, but not identical to him in the way that Emerson or Thoreau would describe. At this point, it might be fun to dive into the philosophical musings of whether God is the universe or whether something can exist non-spatially, but I expect you'd rather me talk about modality, question mark. All right, so then the therapist. That will be the main thrust from now on. My first purpose was to talk about your views on the ontological argument. I believe that we have seen your version is different because of how you view substance and mode. You think that God is the only substance and then there is an infinity of modes, thus your structure is reversed. Spinoza, precisely. If you need more on modes, you have only to ask. Therapist, actually, before the talk of modes, I might have some slight criticisms of your method. First, it is not the case that the property of God's infinitude implies an infinity of attributes in his essence. This is where we this is based on sort of William Lane Craig's reasoning about God's attributes being infinite. According to the pioneering work of Georg Cantor, well, actually, I think here I'm citing Georg Cantor, but I think when I first started to understand this, it was from listening to William Lane Craig, and I guess I just cited Cantor probably has something here as well, so let's see what he has to say. According to the pioneering work of Georg Cantor, the concept of a finite set of infinite properties makes sense. And then footnote 95. Note, I am not saying that there is a greatest set of all sets. Cantor simply proves that it is possible to have a finite series with each member consisting of an actual infinite. For more explications, see Georg Cantor and E. Zermelo, who's the editor, 1966. And this title is in German here, so I'm not going to write it on the board. But let me just make sure that there's not more on the next page. Yeah, there's not. Okay. So the concept of a finite set of infinite properties makes sense. So where each member of a finite set is infinite, right? And Spinoza, I actually haven't read The Youth, okay? If I may get a chance to get a copy of his work, the therapist jumps in and says, using transfinite numbers, consider the set Aleph null, Aleph 1, and Aleph 2, right? Each member of the aggregate is infinite, but the set as a whole is finite. In the same way, simply because the depths of God's attributes are infinite, it does not follow that he has infinite attributes. Continuing with cardinal arithmetic, not even all of God's attributes must be infinite. For example, there can be an actual infinite set of points between 4 and 5, but 6 will never be a part of that set. Analogously, space does not have to be infinite along with the other infinite attributes of God. As for the doctrine of pantheism, we can at the very least listen to the arguments of Nagasawa over the reasoning of Bob Adams. Moreover, and so I'm saying we do want to listen to the reasoning of Nagasawa instead of Robert Adams. All right. Moreover, to the scholar looking for a traditional doctrine of God and the universe, the popular view is to say that God is incorporeal, and thus his relationship to the universe is one of coexistence with every point in space. Spinoza, dagnabbit, son, can we get on to modes? Therapist, precisely. Consider the following question. What is your view on modes? Spinoza, okay, for simplicity's sake, I adhere to a doctrine called the necessity of the modes. I believe, quote, nothing in the universe is contingent, but all things are conditioned to exist and operate in a particular manner by the necessity of the divine nature. And then that's the end of the quote, so I say footnote 96, ethics, and then prop 29. So that's the shortened version of the citation. Okay, therapist. As a child, what was your life like? Spinoza. Well, my father buried 3 wives, and 3 of his 6 children died before reaching adulthood. My mother, therapist interrupts, never mind that. Please tell us more about this necessitarianism. Spinoza. Now just a second. You've been making subtle jabs at me for the last 20 minutes. I am trying to explain my philosophy, but every time I start, you cut me off. Do you realize that I was just listing a proposition? I proved the claim in the proofs and the note. I proved the claim in the proof of the notes. Anyway, quote, things could not have been brought into being by God in any manner or in any order different from that which has in fact obtained. And then footnote 97, Ibid, Prop 33. Okay, shortened citation. And the 33 is the page number probably. So if you want a secular defense of this view, read Timothy Williamson's excellent book. And therapist, I've read both, and I have some problems with both of them. I would like to discuss them if, and then ... Okay, so here's what I say. At this point, Mr. Spinoza could not bear the conversation any longer. The unfortunate reality of the situation was even if we'd been able to continue, the claims were too radical and not related closely enough to the topic at hand. Therefore, it is with these nuggets of discovery that the reader must move forward. Right, so that concludes the section on Spinoza. Hopefully you can see that I think these ideas that Spinoza have are just a bit outlandish. That's why I had sort of the therapist cutting him off. That's why I was sort of trying to push his views to one side. Not so that these views aren't interacted with or taken seriously. Well, we don't want them to be taken too seriously. We want them to be addressed seriously. But hopefully people wouldn't hold to these things. philosophically, that is anyways. If it's an enculturation or if you've grown up thinking something, then that's a little bit different. We're talking about academic philosophy here, though, and what we'd want to believe. And I think, at least as far as the ontological argument is concerned, at least as far as the metaphysics that we're trying to talk about here is concerned, we just kind of I kind of label people like Spinoza, and to some extent Peter Van Wagen, as just having these kind of sort of out-of-the-box, outlandish beliefs that I don't agree with, and I'm not necessarily sure, at least when I was reading this anyways, that I was finding them very persuasive. But the fun thing about talking about Spinoza was that I got to talk about space a little bit, and so that was very cool. So God's relationship to space, that is, because there's some very interesting questions there. Whether or not Spinoza got the right answers, it was still a lot of fun to think about and a lot of fun to write. So so I think that is the end of that, and at least that first section. So thanks everybody, and have a good day. Bye.